Welcome, everyone, to the Great Mystery Fireside Chat with Terri Daniel, Revolutionary Insights into Death and Dying. Terri is an ordained interfaith minister, clinical chaplain, and intuitive counselor who assists dying and grieving individuals to discover a more spiritually spacious understanding of death and beyond. In 2010, she founded the Afterlife Education Foundation and its annual conference, which is taking place in June in Portland, Oregon. And it's my pleasure to start the conversation now with Terri. Terri, thank you so much for being with us and for the wonderful and so important work that you're doing.
Thank you, Robin. I'm so happy to be here doing this with you. This is exciting. Thanks.
And I understand that one of the key turning points that really set you on this path was the death of your son, which you talk about in your book, A Swan in Heaven.
Yes, that is, the way I usually tell this story is I have always been a spiritual person. I've been metaphysically minded my whole life. My mother and grandmother are both intuitive, and that was always just natural to me. I read the Tibetan Book of the Dead when I was 19, so I was always into this. So fast forward, when my son was diagnosed with a life-threatening illness at age 10, I was 48 at the time. I had a lot of preparation for understanding the interdimensional nature of an experience like that and the metaphysical meaning of it. So I reacted differently than a lot of parents might react. I mean, obviously there was grief and pain and shock and fighting to change it and all of that, but there wasn't as much of that as one might expect, because I was able to look at it as an agreement and to say to myself and to my son's soul, well, this is interesting. Wonder why we're doing this. Let's look at this. Let's understand this. Let's follow this and see what we're supposed to learn and what we're supposed to do. And here we are. This is the answer to that question.
Yeah. Wow. What a bold position to take, though. I mean, drawing on that inner strength. It seems like in our society that that there's like this unspoken sense that death is failure.
Absolutely, and it's gotten more that way since the Industrial Revolution. It hasn't been that long in the West since we dealt with death pretty well. You know, we had land, we buried our dead in our family graveyard right outside on the property when we had property. When grandma or somebody died, we laid them out on the kitchen table and cleaned them and dressed them and prayed over them, and the whole family came. We were used to death. We were used to seeing animals die, but we moved away from the farms and into the cities, and that's when that all changed. I mean, there have been several moments in history where that changed. That's the most recent one, is the Industrial Revolution. The real intense fear and horror about death really kind of escalated during the plagues in Europe. Because the deaths were so terrible and gruesome, and you saw rotting bodies everywhere, and people screamed in agony, and they were the worst imaginable kinds of deaths. So that, going back, contributed a lot to our aversion to death.
I wonder if there's a way that we can somehow make some little separation in our minds with like death and suffering.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And I think that's what we're trying to do. You know, that death is actually the end of suffering.
Right.
And if more people could understand that death is not the end of existence, but just a doorway to another form of existence, then we could see that the suffering isn't because of loss. It isn't because the relationship is over or ended or lost. The suffering is really kind of temporary because we learn that the relationship continues in another form. And we have to learn about those forms in order to work with that.
You know, what do you think are the stories from our you know, various religious traditions and spiritual traditions that either support the afterlife or that we have somehow lost, and so now are experiencing this kind of fear and dread, and you know, spending all this money at the end of life to try to, you know, save an extra 10 minutes or 2 days for someone's life.
The stories that support a conscious understanding of the afterlife, I think a lot of those, just talking about the Judeo-Christian culture now, and you know, other cultures are more supportive, so we'll just stick with this one. They're found in Judeo-Christian scripture in the Gospels that were not included in the biblical canon. In order to understand the afterlife, we would have to first understand what I like to call the interlife. So if we first understand where we come from before we are born in physical form, we can have a better understanding of where we go to when we are finished with that physical form. And if you look at the creation mythologies of the Gnostic Christians, they describe something very similar to what Abraham described through Esther Hicks about how it all begins in this stream of energy at the beginning of the universe. And there's really no beginning because there's no time. But somewhere in the stream, there is a thought or an intention of wanting to pull out of the stream so we can see ourselves from a different perspective. That is how physical matter is created. And if you look at it that way, without all the dogma and the narrative and the stories and the sin and the angry God, if you just strip all that stuff out, you can get a sense of, oh, this is where we came from. So if we look at death, we can see that that is where we go back to. And it's much less fearful because we're going home.
Yeah. To this like pool of consciousness, or this, how do you see it? What is your vision of the afterlife, or from your experiences working with people, with your work with hospice and your son and probably other friends and family members?
Well, that's a very broad question because it's different for everybody. So for me, because I've been in touch with my son from the other side, and he's told me a lot about what he's doing and what he's working on, plus other channeled material. You know, when I first got into this work, I started to only read channeled books, and people would say, hey, read this book and read that book, and it's like, I won't read it unless it's channeled, because that just seemed like the true truth to me. And if you look at the channeled material beginning with the Seth books, remember, from the 70s?
Yes.
Conversations with God, Glenda Green's book, Love Without End, Course in Miracles, of course. I'm looking at my bookshelf, but I mean, there's tons of them. They're so consistent, what they describe about what we are, why we're here, where we go when we die, and what our work is. It's amazing. I mean, this is not scientific, but I'd say 99% consistency from one channeled piece of work to another, where you don't find that in more narrative type of books. So based on that and my own experience, I see the afterlife as home base, that stream from which we emerge, and we work just as hard on our growth and our lessons and our stuff when we are there as we do when we are here. However, it's a lot more efficient there because we're not bogged down by the third dimensional body and the ego and all the stuff that we need in order to survive in a body. That stuff's gone. So it's like having a more clear channel. You're able to see your history. You're able to see the Akashic record. You're able to feel the feelings of everything that you've experienced and other people have experienced with you. So a lot of information just being received all the time. And because there is no time, there's no time limit. So it's not like, oh, I better figure this out before what? Before I die? There's no time limit.
So the soul continues to evolve here and through different expressions and different forms of reincarnation.
And I've also learned that reincarnation, you know, contrary to what a lot of people think, reincarnation is not required. We have a choice. We don't have to incarnate. We can do anything we want. We can just disappear into the ether, or we can guide our loved ones from the other side. We can incarnate or not. And this is a very interesting spin on this. A lot of these teachings came from the East, and Buddhism for centuries was kind of hidden behind the mountains in Tibet, in the monasteries, you know, in places where people couldn't easily go and the monks didn't really come out. And it wasn't until China invaded Tibet in 1950 that the monks and the teachings were forced out. So the monasteries were burned, the monks went into exile in India and eventually trickled into Europe. And as a result of that, we have these teachings about reincarnation.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't really have that in the West. You'd have to look really hard to find it prior to the 1960s. So what happened with these ideas, when they got into Western hands, they became Westernized. So we took ideas like karma and made it into good and bad karma, judgment and punishment. Karma as, you know, punishment from this remote God in the sky who punishes us. That's not really what it was meant to be. And the afterlife in reincarnation is the same way. There is not a third-party remote being out in the universe somewhere that sentences us to incarnation. Who is making that choice? Mm-hmm. If it is required, who's requiring it other than our own free will?
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's a nice way to see things. Because I
get really caught up in religious history and stuff. So
I think
I just do that.
It's great to I think to bust some of these, you know, notions that they're almost like invisible. You know, we have these perceptions of things. You know, it's almost like believing in Santa Claus.
Yeah.
You know, it's like we have these perceptions of things that we don't question. They're just kind of in there. And even if our logical mind tells us it doesn't make sense, we somehow still react to them or, you know, respond based on these ideas. And I think it's so important to bring them out and look at them and, you know, say, wow, well, what about this?
Yeah. Yeah, this is why I, in my journey, thought it was so important to go back to school and study theology and religious history, because I wanted to see that. I wanted to learn about where that comes from and be able to have an intelligent, functional conversation about that in my work helping people deal with death. And so when people are afraid of punishment, for example, I can, if they are willing, retrace with them the conditioning they got in their childhood or wherever that made them have that fear, and hopefully help them relieve that fear.
It seems so important that we let go of guilt and, you know, blame to this judgment that we have, you know, and have another perspective on that. And I think that's part of the fear of dying, that this failure thing or being afraid of, you know, oh, I did bad things, so it's, you know, I'm going to burn in hell, or, you know, these kinds of images, rather than just seeing that we're evolving and, you know, being open to, and it sounds like what you were saying about, you know, your experience of the afterlife, it's more like frequency, that we're tuning to a different frequency.
I once heard Marianne Williamson describe it this way, and I've kind of stolen this from her, but I always attribute it to her when I say it. She said it's like, she did a little recording about life after death, little known, obscure little cassette tape I got one day, but she said it's like television. So if you look at your television and it's turned off, there's nothing coming through broadcasting at the moment, but it's still going through the signals. Mike could probably explain this better than I can, but you know, the messages coming through the cable wire or the electronic frequencies, whatever they are still being transmitted. We just have the TV turned off. Or we have it on Channel 5, and we're getting, you know, a cartoon, and then we change it to Channel 7, and we're getting an old movie or whatever. That's how the universe works. I really think that electronic technology is kind of modeled after telepathic technology in a way. I think the whole internet is kind of a replication of what goes on telepathically. I mean, when you send an email, you don't know how it goes there or where it goes. What is cyberspace? You know, and so when I started, you know, channeling and thinking about this stuff, I kept getting these analogies that the internet is a very primitive expression of how that works, and we're kind of evolving into a higher understanding of that. Maybe someday all we'll have to do to send an email is just think it.
I think so. At one of our conferences, Michio Kaku, who's a physicist, was saying that he thought the internet was like the beginning of like the Type 1 in the Star Trek. Use Star Trek as an analogy. You know, the Type 1 telephone system for telepathy.
Yes, exactly.
You know, that it's like, and even with all this instant messaging and stuff, you know, I think it's helping us open up maybe those channels.
I think so too. Maybe that's what we need to get the idea, you know, so you can take someone who's never considered telepathy as a possibility and say to them, well, you send emails, that's traveling over some kind of frequency that's not physical. It's not going through a wire, really. You know, and now we have this thing called the cloud. You know. So maybe if these concepts are here to help people begin to open up to those things.
So also from your experience with your work, you know, having this other understanding of the afterlife and that, you know, we don't disappear, you know, we continue to live as souls and are evolving, and letting go of that sense of failure and blame. And for the ones that are left behind, like you with your son, me with my beloved, you know, the issue of grief, there is still that.
Yes, there is still that. And while I completely honor the grief process, I have learned some different ways to look at it. And in fact, that's what my new book is about, Turning the Corner on Grief Street. I would never deny or dismiss the very real pain of grief. But I also think that if we could shift our understanding of birth and death and everything in between, we might grieve a little bit differently. And I thought this was a pretty radical idea until I read a book by George Bonanno, who is a professor, can't remember where, Harvard or someplace like that, Columbia, I think. He wrote a book called The Other Side of Sadness. And he's studied grieving in cultures around the world. And his point that he made is that, again, we're talking about Westerners, are very soft. And if you look at a culture, if you look at, you know, starving countries in Africa where people have 7 children and 6 of them die, they're, I don't want to say hardened, but they see death as part of the natural cycle, and they don't become obsessive or addicted to their grief. They grieve, they scream and wail and do rituals, and perhaps that is why they are healthier about it. So I was glad to see that there are a lot of studies being done on that, because that's always been my sense. And if I could tell a little story about that, in the hospital where I worked as a chaplain last year, and this is in my book, I compare 2 families. And one of them was a Native American family. The grandmother was being taken off of life support. She wasn't that old. She was probably 70. There were probably 20 family members there, including young children up through every age. And they were standing around her bed in the intensive care unit with drums and rattles and chanting and dancing and singing and doing the whole Native American thing.
Mm-hmm.
They were screaming and crying and wailing, and they were out in the hallways crying, and the people in ICU had never seen anything like this before. And I was so honored that I got called in as the chaplain to be with this family.
Mm-hmm.
The grandmother then died, and I got called off to something else. But when I came back about 2 hours later, the family was still there because there was other business they were taking care of. Specifically, they were taking her body home with them to bury on their own land, which is also very rare in a hospital. So they had to stay for a couple hours. And when I came back, everybody was happy. They were laughing, they were eating, the little kids were playing, and it was like they had this big burst of grief with ritual, and that is key, so that they could just get that out of them, and now they were at peace. And now they were going to take her body to their land and bury it. The other family that I contrast with this story, the father, he was about 80, also in ICU being taken off life support. There was his wife and 2 sons present. They showed no emotion at all when but they did call me as a chaplain to do a prayer.
Mm-hmm.
And when I tried to engage them in conversation and get them to talk about their feelings, all I got was anger. One son was angry at the other son about some stuff and whatever. And then he died. The wife had a couple of little tears, and that was that. And I found out later that they sued the hospital for some little thing. And that is the contrast. You see what I'm saying? In how people deal with grief. This family was so angry and had so many issues that were not expressed or resolved, and they didn't express the feelings. They just dumped it all on the hospital. Mm-hmm. Here's what I'll do with my pain. I'll sue the hospital. Where the Native American family had tools. They had tools. They had ritual and bonding and permission to be emotional. So
it seems like it seems like the indigenous cultures have rituals for different rites of passage. You know, like when one becomes an adult. You know, like from an adolescent, and menopause for, menses for young girls when they start their period, or menopause, or, you know, different things, and birth and death.
Yes.
And how important it is. And do you see any, I don't know if revival is the right word, but any, you know, interest in these coming back? You know, people getting together and wanting to do more rituals or things to acknowledge the loss on the physical level, but acknowledging the continuation of life too.
Absolutely, that's definitely coming back, and it's been coming back for a long time. And I like to credit our baby boom generation with having a hand in that. There were so many things. We started to, in the 60s, embrace indigenous cultures and imitate them and borrow their rituals, and not only indigenous cultures, but certainly Eastern cultures, of course. You know, we started to meditate. We started to do psychedelics and travel to the spirit world. We brought in shamanism, paganism, all of this stuff that we were told was bad and that we weren't supposed to do in the West. Here it all comes. And so here we are now as baby boomers. Our parents are dying. We're facing our own deaths. We're having to make decisions about that. And we have these rituals available to us that in my mother's generation, there were a few religious rituals that she didn't really understand, that, you know, she did just because that's what Jewish people were supposed to do, or that's what Catholics are supposed to do. But there was really no education or understanding of the meaning behind them or the real power that they hold. They're all good, and they all work, but they don't work as well if you don't really know what they mean. So that is something that's definitely changing.
When I was young, like around I don't know, 12, my very best friend, one of her grandparents died, and her family was Jewish, and they had a wonderful ritual that I had never experienced, where the family got together, and I think it was for a week. All they did was talk about the person that passed. You know, they told good stories, sad stories, you know, all different kinds of stories, and they just talked and ate and were together in this communion. And what a wonderful way to, you know, like to move through that grieving process.
Yes, and I think people do that anyway. They just don't know it's a ritual. In Judaism, that's called sitting Shiva, and I think they do it for 7 days. And they also have, in Orthodox Judaism, a ritual where you never leave the body alone at all for a minute until it's buried. And I don't really know the origin of that belief because there is no real afterlife beliefs in the core of Judaism, but I think it has something to do with not just the sacredness of the body and the vessel, but keeping the soul company while it makes its transition. So you find rituals like this in every religion. I mean, if you look at the Catholic ritual of last rites, where they're anointing the body, which isn't last rites anymore, it's now they do it for the sick, not just the dying. That's based on an ancient shamanic practice that we actually teach at the conference called the death spiral, where you separate the chakras, you open the chakras, separate the body from the soul and help the soul leave, and then anoint the closing up the body so that it can't get back in. And I can't prove this scientifically, but I suspect that that's where the church learned that particular ritual from. Because these rituals are ancient. We make them up intuitively. They've always been with us.
What do you think about, you know, for people who have lost a loved one, are there any rituals or ways that one can encourage communication, or is it even appropriate? I have a friend whose husband passed about 10 or 11 years ago, and she's never received any message from him and would like to. And I have received messages from Cody. So, you know, when she and I have conversations, I don't know, is there anything you can suggest for those of us who have friends that like that?
Oh, there are so many things. So many things I can suggest. And I actually give very specific instructions on this in my books. The very first thing, if I had to pick one thing, I would say, know that you already are receiving messages. You just don't know how to recognize them as such. I hear this all the time from people who say, I don't receive any messages from my dead person. You know, and I'm so sad because he never communicates with me. All I have is dreams. And I have to say, well, let us begin by realizing that dreams are messages. But people tend to dismiss that because they haven't really studied this stuff. And so they don't really think about what are dreams. So a lot of it begins with an education in all the symbols and all the forms of communication that bounce around the universe. And so the first thing would be to trust what you think you're receiving as something you truly are receiving. If you think it's a coincidence, I guarantee you that it's not. So people will say, oh, I went into a store the other day and I heard my father's favorite song on the radio. And it's an obscure little song from the 1920s that you never hear on the radio. But here it came on the radio that day, which happened to be his birthday. But what an interesting coincidence. And so I just kind of want to slap the face, you know, and say, it's not a coincidence. So I think that's the first thing that inhibits people, is they are getting the messages and they just don't realize it. The second thing that's really important is if you want to increase your ability to communicate across dimensions, is you have to clean out your heart. So if you are really angry, if you blame someone from the death, if you're focusing that energy on something that is heavy instead of light. So, for example, I talked with a lot of parents whose children have died, and a lot of them died in terrible ways, murders, suicides, killed by a drunk driver. And I see parents whose life is all about making sure that drunk driver goes to prison. And that is a type of energy that can close the conduit down a little bit. If you see this experience, and this is pretty radical and people don't like it when I say this, if you see this experience as a random and meaningless event, or you're mad at God, whatever you think God is, for this terrible thing that happened, it's going to be very hard to shift your consciousness into a place where you can open up to interdimensional existence. By contrast, if you understand that this experience is an intersection for a group of souls to come together, you, your teenage kid, the drunk driver, the paramedics, the grandmother, the witnesses, everybody expanding. It's like endless ripples of soul family, because a shift of some sort in consciousness was supposed to happen to everybody. If you can see it that way, then the shift will be easier to happen to you.
Yeah. I feel that about grief, too, one of the gifts of grief, and that I think you talk about this in your book about Turning Grief Street, is that you have to really look at what your core beliefs are.
Yeah.
And, you know, and that's part of that process of getting rid of that, so that you're getting rid of the anger and the blame,
Yeah.
you know. If I would have given more carrot juice, or, you know.
More wheatgrass. He wouldn't have died if he had more wheatgrass.
Yeah. If only we took that vacation, or, you know, whatever the story is.
And we all have that. You know, I mean, I have a huge bag of guilt about my son's life. You know, there were a million things I could have done better. But I know that everything happened exactly the way it should. And in changing my view of things and questioning my beliefs and all of that, I am grateful for all of it. But as a mother, I still feel it. And in my deepest, darkest, saddest times, because I am human just like anybody else, I beat myself up and I walk around saying, oh my God, I'm a terrible person. Why did I do that? You know, I still do that. I'm still here on earth. You know, I would never claim to be beyond that in any way. So, but it is important, if you want to raise your consciousness, to be willing to study and learn and educate yourself about other ways of thinking about it. And the way to do that is to read channeled books and go to these conferences and listen to these teachers and ask for this information, because it's definitely out there. Come to our conference. You'll find out all about it.
Let's talk about your conference, because it looks absolutely amazing. And I'm so happy that we get to have a couple of the other people from your conference, you know, joining this series on Connecting with Heaven. But tell us about the conference and how that started and who's going to be there.
Well, it actually did start because of what we're talking about seeing grief in a different way. And I don't want to veer away from that subject too much, because we want to make sure we get back there. But after my son died and I wrote my book, A Swan in Heaven, I thought, oh, I guess my audience for this book is bereaved parents who've had a child die. Made sense. So I tried to go out and start speaking to groups for bereaved parents, and I found out very quickly that a lot of these groups, and I won't say that one of the biggest national, actually international groups for bereaved parents does not allow any talk of mediumship or after-death communication at all. They had a big conference right here in my own hometown. They brutally rejected my proposal to tell my story about communicating with my son, because they said, we don't encourage this, we don't allow religion, as if that has anything to do with religion, and it will upset many of our parents who are not receiving messages when they hear that other people are receiving messages. Perhaps it will be comforting to some, but it will be disturbing to others. So my response was, well, that's always true. It comforts some and it's uncomfortable for others, but does that mean we dismiss those who will find peace through this? We just throw them out the window? And so it was a long battle, and I found out that many of the other authors and spiritual teachers in this genre were also rejected from speaking and presenting at this group. And I called some of them on the phone, and I said, we got to do something about this. Let's start a conference of our own. So that's how it started, was to fill that need, that nobody was really talking about that in relation to grief. So that's how we started the first one, and it's just exploded from there.
It's such an important conversation, and I think one of the things that's exciting is that quantum physics and the new science is kind of also supporting all this information, all these experiences.
Yeah, it's all connecting.
Yeah,
it's all coming together.
Awareness of non-locality and these things. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we have teachers like Deepak Chopra who has one foot in both worlds, right? Educated both in the East and the West, medical doctor and metaphysician, who actually, my favorite book of his is called Life After Death, The Burden of Proof. And he talks all about non-locality, and it's not one of his most well-known books. I'm not surprised, because people just still don't like to talk about death, even though they've read every one of Deepak Chopra's books about all the other stuff he talks about. They don't read the one about death. People are still afraid of it. But yes, it's a conversation that it definitely has to happen. And there are conferences and retreats about all kinds of spiritual topics, meditation, out-of-body journeying. But I think it's pretty new that these topics are now being connected to death specifically. And our audience, we are finding, is not really the same people who go to the meditation conferences and the spiritual conference. Our audience, amazingly, is really the mainstream. Regular folks who are curious about death or who have had a transformational experience in relation to the death.
Well, it's so wonderful that you're offering that. And for people that aren't able, because it's in Portland, it's, what is it, June 5th through the 8th?
Yes.
If people aren't able to go to the live event, will you have recordings of the presentations that they can order afterwards?
Yes. As a matter of fact, we just confirmed that yesterday.
Wonderful.
So there will be a live stream that you can actually tap into in real time during the conference, and if you subscribe to that or however it's set up, then you don't have to watch it in real time. You can watch it after the fact as often as you want. So yes, and it won't have the entire conference, but it will have key presentations that we've picked that are the most new and innovative and important.
That's so wonderful that those will be offered. And I personally love being able to access information, from where I am in Spain, that's happening in other places in Europe or in the U.S. But, and also I know there's nothing like being at the live event if you can.
Oh, yeah.
There's something about that, that sense of live community and being with kindred spirits and the energy. It's just really, really powerful and supportive.
Well, we were in St. Louis last year and at a big hotel, and the hotel meeting planning person came up to me and she said, we have meetings here all the time. We have big companies, Fortune 500 companies. We have these big conferences. And everybody at those conferences is usually really grumpy because they're there for their job and they don't really want to be there. And they're not really happy. She says, your conference is the happiest conference I've ever seen. Everybody's just walking around beaming and smiling and floating and loving and hugging. And it's a conference about death. How does that make any sense? And I said, it's because we're talking about death from a different perspective. People walked in here devastated about their loss, and they come out healed, dare I say. But that's what people tell me.
I think also that actually it's a deeper conversation about life. You know, that
Yeah,
birth and death are like the gates that we pass through, but it's the underlying stream of life that is continuous, and it's getting a deeper understanding of what life is.
yes, because there is no difference, because there is no death.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's really the thing. There is no death. There is just a continuation of life in a different form. I remember talking. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say one of the things I remember years ago when that Ram Dass said was about when his guru. He told the story of when he learned of his guru's death and how he dropped his body. And when Cody died, I thought that was the most accurate description. You know, he dropped his body.
Yeah, I
That's
love
all
the way
that.
Ram Dass described that.
Yeah, that's actually all that happened.
I've heard it described too as if you have your hand with a glove and you take off the glove.
Mm-hmm.
The glove is the body. You drop it on the floor. It's just this limp little glove. The hand is still alive. I love
Yeah.
that analogy too. There's a
Yeah.
lot of wonderful analogies like that.
Yeah. And they help change our like they help little things click in our imagination to help us see things differently.
And you know, receiving communication from the other side is not a gift. It is, I call it a birthright. And if you go back to what we were talking earlier about how we emerged out of the stream of creation consciousness and sort of popped out and decided to take physical form, our connection to that stream is not cut off when we do that. And the Buddhists refer to that connection as the silver cord. When you're dreaming, you're still connected to this by the silver cord, and when you die, the silver cord is severed because it frees the body, but the telepathic connection is still there. So I've often compared it to when you take your toddler to preschool for the first time and you drop this little 3-year-old off in this strange place, you don't just leave them there and go move to Mexico. You know, you keep your connection. The teachers know how to find you. If anything happens, they'll call you. You'll be back in a few hours to pick the kid up. That's what it's like when we come to Earth. It's like being dropped off at preschool, but our connection to our parents, so to speak, is still intact. And they're there if we need them. And if you look at religious traditions where God is called Father or Mother or Creator, it is really kind of like that. And you know, that gets into a whole other discussion about creation, which we could talk to. But you know, there kind of is a Mother, Father, Creator in that sense. But it's not separate from us. It's just an aspect of us. We are our own Mother, Father, Creator.
That's a wonderful idea. But it requires us to take responsibility for our actions.
Yeah, and it requires us to really shed a lot of old ideas. In religious speak, there's a term called crisis of faith. And what that means, and I help people with this all the time, if you are attached to a particular religious belief system or tradition, and something happens and that tradition doesn't make sense anymore, this is really traumatic for a lot of people. As an example, one mother that I worked with once had 4 of her children die in 4 separate, unrelated events. One of them went to war and died in war, another was a motorcycle accident, another was cancer, I don't know, but 4 unrelated events. And she was a Christian, and she said to me, I don't understand why God let this happen. I thought if I was a good person and pleased God, that nothing bad would ever happen to me. But the worst possible things have happened to me. And I don't know what to think. Why would God do this? And my response to her and to people who say this to me all the time is, well, it depends what you think God is. And your choice now is to hold the idea of this definition you have of God as something or someone that will protect you from conflict if you do certain things. And you can hold that, and you can be disappointed and angry that it didn't work that way, or you can consider the possibility that's maybe not what God is, and maybe that's not how it works. And a lot of people stay stuck right there in that deciding point, and they have to realize that, if they want to expand and heal, that God is not a man in the sky with a clipboard making decisions and punishing us if we don't follow certain rules. It's a very infantile view of the divine. It's neurotic, and a lot of people learned this when they were 5 years old in Sunday school and never moved past that 5-year-old's interpretation of what was told to them. So they're sort of still thinking like a 5-year-old.
It's interesting because we just had a question come through from Wanda, and it was about this very thing. If you think good thoughts, or if you're good enough, or that bad things won't happen.
Oh, don't get me started on that. Yes, so interesting. I was talking earlier about how a lot of ideas came to us from the East and from the cosmos, and we westernized them. So we took the idea of karma, for example, and made it good and bad with punishment. What we have now that is known as the law of attraction or positive thinking, as Wanda just described it, is also got a westernized punishment kind of spin on it. I am someone who really objects to the way a lot of people understand the law of attraction. When somebody says to me, oh, if you just think positive thoughts, you'll get everything you want, I absolutely don't believe in that at all, because it's the ego that is thinking those thoughts. We have to realize that there's two aspects of us. There's the ego body, which operates the physical body. We need that ego to be on earth. We need to make money and find love and have sex and find security. We need all that to live with. Then there's the soul, which doesn't need any of that. And both of these pieces are working together. So when you say, I'm going to think positive thoughts so that I can get that job that I want, or so that I won't be poor and I can have abundance, the soul maybe has a different idea, because sometimes you don't get that job or that car. It really doesn't work that way. And then you have to say, well, God, positive thinking didn't work. And it's just like the lady whose 4 children died. To me, that is no different than the infantile view of God protecting you if you're a good Christian. The New Age version of that is, if I'm a good New Age woo-woo person and I only think positive thoughts, like The Secret told me to do, then I'll have everything I want. But it doesn't work any different than the Christian idea works, because it doesn't work that way. Because we're supposed to have conflict in order to grow. And we came here to grow, not to live a conflict-free existence, not to have perfect health, perfect wealth, perfect love. We can do that in heaven. We can't do that here.
I think that's so important, because I think people think, I ate all the right things, why did I get sick?
Because sickness had something to teach you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it seems like like I've heard some wonderful stories of people who have been really sick with cancer or different terminal things, and through that process, they let go of everything. They let go of their anger at their children or their families. They let go of worrying about the mortgage. They let go, and there have been stories about people having spontaneous healing because of that letting go also. But again, if that isn't a failure, then healing isn't necessarily like the desired result. Like, it doesn't matter.
It doesn't look like you think it's supposed to look.
Yeah.
So are you familiar with the Emmanuel books?
Yes, I love Emmanuel.
Yes, speaking of channeled books.
Yes.
one of my favorite things in there, you know how they're in question and answer format?
Yeah.
So one of the questions is it true there is a cure for all illness? And the answer is yes, if you understand death as a cure. And, you know, again, it doesn't look like what we think it's going to look like. Because we're back to that ego versus the soul. It's a part of us. You know how, remember in the old cartoons, or I don't know where that came from, where somebody would be contemplating an action and they'd have a devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other whispering in their ear telling them what to do?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the ego and the soul. You know, the devil is the ego saying, hey, you got to have a lot of money. Let's go get laid. Let's get a Cadillac. You know, and the angel is saying, okay, you can do all those things, but it's not going to really satisfy you. It's not going to really look like you think it's going to look. And that's the struggle we have all the time while we're embodied. So the healing, you know, you look at people who are fighting, healing from cancer and doing every intervention possible, and they spend years suffering with chemo and radiation, and then they die anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the healing, is they were finally freed from this. It could have taken any form. We don't know. But the process of going through that suffering was obviously necessary for the person to learn many, many things. I can make up a whole list of things that someone can learn from that. The family members learn, the doctors learn. We all learn on each other because we're all connected. There is no separation. The doctor is not separate from the patient.
And it's probably similar in a different way when people that are like seemingly perfectly healthy and all of a sudden just like drop dead for no apparent reason.
You know, it's all, we don't know why, you know, but there is a why. And this was explained to me in a channeled message from my guides. And a lot of people have heard me talk about this. I was given this visual of a kaleidoscope. And if you think of every action in the entire universe, or every event, as a little piece in the kaleidoscope, if you look at a kaleidoscope, the pieces are separate, but they all move as one. So everything that happens in the universe, somebody gets cancer, somebody dies, somebody's born, there's an earthquake over here, there's a tsunami over here, there's a war over there. Every event that happens in every microsecond clicks and turns the kaleidoscope. One little click. All the pieces fall apart, but they reassemble in a different form. That's happening all the time. That is the circle of life. And the circle idea is found in every religion. We have the Native American sacred hoop, and we have the Hindu wheel of life. We have Celtic circles. This is how the universe works. So if you're really connected to all the little pieces in the kaleidoscope, none of them could ever be separated from you. Your loved ones cannot be lost, and no event happens by itself. So when that drunk driver slams into your car, all these little pieces move along with it, and you have to sort of back off and look at it from the view from space, which is the way the soul sees it, rather than the little tiny ego view that says, oh, I got in this terrible car accident and now I'm paralyzed. That's a little view over here. The big view is, how does this work for the collective?
Yes.
And that's the view the soul is always looking for. And that's a good illustration of why the ego is looking at something quite different.
You know, back to Emmanuel, one of the questions and answers that I really enjoyed too, I think Ram Dass asked him what it was like when he died. And he said it was like taking off a tight shoe.
Yes, I remember that one. Yeah. One of the wonderful things about mediumship and channeling is that you can have people tell you what it's like to die. My son gave me a very detailed description of what it was like to die. And I wrote about it in A Swan in Heaven, and I'll see if I can summarize it just a little bit. If you're ever with a person who's dying, there's a thing that their eyes do. So if they're lying down on their back, they're looking up at the ceiling, but their eyes are kind of going back. If you hospice workers, we see this all the time. And I had never seen that until my son died. And when he started communicating with me from the afterlife, I asked him, what were your eyes doing? What was that? And he gave me this description. He said, I was like a baby bird coming out of an egg, but I didn't have to crack the egg myself. It was opening from the top above me. Little cracks were opening, and light was coming in through the cracks. And I was looking up at the light coming through the cracks in the egg. And when I heard that, I immediately, because I doubted this stuff, and I said, oh, I must have heard that somewhere. I'm sure I read that in a book somewhere, and it's just in my mind, and it's coming out. I Googled for weeks, to see if I could find that anywhere, and couldn't find it anywhere. And to this day, everyone I've told that to, no one's ever heard it before. It came right from him. And another thing he said, and this is my favorite, is, and again, you see this when you're working with dying people, the breath, there's all these different kinds of breathing that happens. And people are struggling to breathe. And he said that with every struggling breath on earth, every struggling breath on earth becomes light in heaven. So with every breath that you gasp for on earth, it's like taking a deep breath of light in heaven. And we use the word heaven not in the traditional sense, obviously. And as the breaths are growing weaker and weaker in the body, the breathing of light in heaven is getting stronger and stronger. Till eventually one stops and the other takes over. So in heaven we are breathing light. What is breath on earth becomes light in heaven.
Kind of like, when a baby's being born, it gets squeezed and pushed and, like it seems really painful and hard to be able to come out.
Yeah, it's exactly like that. And the baby is not really alive until it takes its first breath. So it's the mirror image breath. And that's exactly what my son called it, the breath mirror. It's the mirror image of the first breath you take in the body is a mirror image of the last breath you take in life, in which you're breathing light instead of air. So we can find out a lot about what it's like to die. Now, when my son was describing this is also a very important little piece for people who are interested in near-death experience. My son was dead. It wasn't a near-death experience. He was fully and completely dead and was fully and completely integrated on the other side when he told me this stuff. In near-death experiences that people report, you're not going to hear a lot of this because they didn't go far enough, right? They only went really just through the gateway a little bit, and then they came back. So what we hear from near-death experiences is really just a report of being in the foyer, just kind of, in the holding area. So it's a very different kind of information than you're going to get from someone who's actually been dead for a while, who can tell you more about the much further reaches of where you go and the work that you do on the other side.
Yeah. I had somebody tell me after Cody died that they got a message from him that he was able to do a lot more because he was very involved. He was an activist. And that he was able to do a lot more from over there.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, my son over there is the reason I'm doing everything I'm doing. I would not be sitting here talking to you about this without him. I wouldn't even know any of this stuff without him. I call him the man behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz. So he is working, and this is an agreement that we had. And one of the first messages he gave me after he died was something like, okay, we did it. High five. Now let's get this party started. We've got work to do. And I realized that this was an agreement that we had before we came in, and I've got a lot of information on that that's come to me over the years. And that's what it's all about. And I think that we are all being assisted by loved ones and guides and angels and others in the various higher realms to do everything that we're doing here on Earth.
Yeah.
We're not doing this alone.
And I had wondered when Cody passed if like my trying to communicate with him would be like taking him away from his purpose on the other side. But I've come to feel, and maybe, and it seems like you're sharing this, that that's not the case, that we can communicate and it's not taking anyone away from their new tasks.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's actually really simple to understand that. All you have to do is understand the difference between linear and nonlinear time space. Mm-hmm. So if somebody came and knocked on my door right now and I had to go answer the door, it would take me away from you. Mm-hmm. Because I live in the third dimension where there's linear time and space. You are over here on my desk, mm-hmm. and that person's over there at my door, and I have to move across that distance. I can't be in both places at once. Mm-hmm. In the higher realms, that linear time space doesn't exist at all. You don't have to go from the desk to the door because you're not in physical density. So your dead people can talk to you right now, and believe me, they are, while we're having this conversation, and still be doing what they're doing because they're not being pulled away from something else. Because it's all energetic. It's not physical. It's not like me leaving the desk to go answer the door. There's no line. It's a circle instead of a line.
Yeah. Yeah. We have Regina has a question. She's asking you, what other different ways do you know from hospice or otherwise, from what you've just said, that would describe the dying?
The process of dying?
What other different ways you know from hospice or otherwise what you just described on dying? We could maybe ask Regina if you'd like to.
I'm not quite sure what she means by that.
I'm going to unmute her microphone, so Regina, you can ask yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So yes, I'm asking about the process of dying, what she's observed, what Terri has observed. She just described something about the eyes and about there are so many ways, I suppose, where you can see that someone is about to leave.
So you're talking about physical observations?
Yes, more the physical, and also if you have heard, I mean, in this you described just about your son communicating to you how it was. So even if you have other, let me call it stories about this kind of process, so both from the other side and also from our physical realm.
I have many, many stories, but I could actually, for stories, one of the best books ever written about this is by David Kessler, and it's called Visions, Trips, and Crowded Rooms. And it's all about the deathbed visions and the communications that are going on with people that are dying. If you talk to any hospice worker, any hospice nurse, anybody who's worked with the dying, they will have stories and stories and stories. I'll tell you one of my favorite ones was a patient that I had, and she declined very quickly over about a week's time, and I was called into her room to do a guided meditation for her. And in this guided meditation, and I do it with people all the time, you close your eyes and you imagine that you're looking at a starry sky full of millions of stars, and you inhale the stars. You imagine that they are just stardust, and with every inhale, you're inhaling the stardust and letting it fill your body. That's how it starts out. I went to see her a few days later, and she said she had a dream that an angel came into her room and gave her some pills to take and put these pills on her tongue, but instead of pills, they were stars. And the angel told her if she just swallowed these pills, these stars, she would go to heaven. She told me this. And I said, oh, that's so beautiful. That's so beautiful. We had this wonderful conversation. And the next day she died. So that is my favorite hospice story of all. And it also shows you how doing guided meditations and giving people visual tools can be really helpful to them in accepting, allowing death to happen and being at peace with it. And these kinds of meditations and these kinds of imagery are non-judgmental and absolutely beautiful. I didn't know anything about her religious preferences at the time. This just came to me as something to say to her. But now that I have become a chaplain, when I work with people in the hospital or in hospice, I have a slightly different approach because I'm bound by certain behavior codes, I guess, that I have to do. And I have learned how to meet people where they are with their religion. So another story, one day I was with a woman who was really, really struggling. She was panicked. She had a lot of anxiety. She couldn't breathe. They couldn't give her any more medication at that moment for some reason, I don't know. And she was just panicked and hysterical, and she was just calling for Jesus. Jesus, come and help me, Lord, Jesus. She was like screaming, crying for Jesus. So I ran and got a Bible and started reading to her. I can't even remember the passage that I read. I could if I thought about it. And she immediately calmed down, immediately. And got in her bed and just lay down and died, like right there and then. So for her, it was bringing in a presence of Jesus was exactly what she needed. And what I've learned now is to really listen to the patients and for them to tell me what they need instead of me walking in and telling them what I think they need, which is something you never, ever do as a chaplain and should never do unless they ask for something different.
Oh, how lovely. And just seeing all the different ways that we can perceive this reality.
Yeah. And it's all about fear versus no fear.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time a person is in hospice care, they have pretty much accepted that they're going to die. Generally, that's how it should work. But there are even people who resist and fight it to the end, and there's a million reasons why. But what would be so helpful is to make sure that people get adequate spiritual care. But not all people want it, and you can't force it on them. And a lot of times they don't want to, like when I do rounds in the hospital now, I'll go into the patient's room, I'll knock on the door, and I'll say, I'm a chaplain, would you like to visit? And they go, oh, no, I'm not religious. Or, oh, no, I'm Jewish. Or, no, thanks. And I really don't like the word chaplain because it conjures an image of somebody walking in with a Bible and a cross, which is most certainly not what I'm doing. And I wish I could walk into the room and say, hello, I'm the spiritual care provider. That might make it a little more acceptable, but even the word spiritual puts people off because they have rejected religion for very legitimate reasons, and they don't even know where to begin opening up to some sort of spirituality at the end of life or during an illness or a trauma at some point. And that's really missing. And speaking of things that are missing, one of the things that I really would like to work toward, and I and my whole community, is bringing transition guidance into clinical settings. We are certainly there in the hospice to help people with this, but what about in the emergency room? What about in the ICU? There's really nobody there whose job it is to help people die because they don't want people to die in the hospital. Literally, they don't. And this is something not a lot of people know. hospitals are rated on various criteria, and one of those is how many deaths do they have. So a hospital will try to get you out of the hospital and into a nursing home so that you'll die there, so that you don't end up on the census of how many people have died. I cannot swear that's 100% true, but that's what I've heard. Just put a little disclaimer there. So, yeah, go ahead.
It seems like the whole medical system is geared toward, trying to preserve life at any cost, almost. It's like,
Absolutely.
And what I love about hospice is it's helping people be comfortable at the end, but not to make prolonging their life an extra, couple of months or this, the goal necessarily.
Right, right. And the problem that we run into is that how can individuals make those decisions if they're not educated, if they don't know all of this stuff that we've been talking about? If somebody is given a life-threatening diagnosis and said, well, we can give you chemo for 6 months, but you might die anyway, or you can spend that 6 months, being with your family, enjoying your time. How does a person make a decision like that? Just an average person whose only education in these things is perhaps what they've learned at church or from movies and TV, or who knows where they're getting their education. It's just so empty. People just don't know. And whose job is it to educate them? I like to think that the hospital chaplain can do that, but there are all these regulations and political correctness things that you kind of have to observe. I mean, if somebody said to me, I just got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and I have 6 months to live, I don't know what to think. I can't tell them what to think, but I'm trained to have a conversation with them in which I can make them feel safe asking questions, and I can answer their questions. But people don't generally change their minds about their beliefs at the end of their life. They pretty much die the way they live. So the answer is that this education has to start in childhood. This is what we should be learning from church and culture, so that we don't have to scramble to figure it out in the last 6 months of life.
Yeah. We have a couple more questions. One is from Meredith. She's asking, what can I do right now to have a clearer communication with my dad? He was hit by a neighbor 5 years ago when the neighbor lost control of his car and went off the road. I have received so many feathers from him over the past 5 years that they fill up a shoebox, but I'm hoping for more of a two-way conversation. He and I were very close, and I miss him so much.
Meredith, I can see you on the screen, and it looks like you've been taking copious notes as we've been talking. I really appreciate that. I love the image of a shoebox full of feathers. That's a lot of feathers. I have a process called writing a letter from heaven. And it's actually a document that you can get by, if you go to, boy, I don't remember how you can get that. I think if you go to my website, swaninheaven.com, and there's a subscribe link there. And if you subscribe, you will get a link taking you to that document. I'm not sure, but you can email me, and I can just email it to you. But basically, it's a process where you write a letter to yourself from your father. Now, a lot of people will write to their father, but this is the opposite, you see. And so basically, it's a process where you sit down with a piece of paper or your computer, and you write, Dear Meredith, and you just start doing automatic writing. Now, as you're doing this, you're going to feel like you're making it all up, and you're going to doubt it. And you may have to do this 100 times before you start to trust it, or it might start to work instantly. And you just write. It starts out what you think your father would say. I'm fine, don't worry about me, I love you, everything's okay. And just keep writing through that, push through it. And just keep writing, writing, writing. And all of a sudden, it's going to feel like it's not you talking. It will feel like him. And then you'll start crying and your heart will burst open, and it's a beautiful, beautiful process. It may or may not work for you. It may work right away. It may take a year. But that's the process that I give people. And I have done this with people in workshops. One woman started writing in Swedish, which was her mother's language. And this woman hadn't spoken in Swedish since she was a little tiny child. And she was in her 70s at this point. So stuff really does come through. I see Meredith. She's blowing her nose. She's crying. That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for receiving that so deeply into your heart. So you're going to try that, right? Okay.
Wonderful.
They want to talk to us. They're standing there around us, jumping up and down, waving their arms, trying to get our attention. You know, and it's not them that's not doing the talking. It's us that's not doing the listening.
Mm-hmm. We have another question from Wanda. Is it Wanda? I'm going to have to go back and find it. Maybe I'll just put her on. It was a question about the different levels. Do you believe that a person's belief in where they go, like are there different frequencies or levels of the afterlife where people go, like higher spirits versus lower frequency spirits? Like, I'm imagining she's thinking if somebody was like kind of unconscious here, somebody was a real environmental polluter, I don't know, something, they beat their wife, or,
okay.
you know.
So what we're doing with that question, and I think Wanda asked a similar question to this before, and I had the same answer. We're cloaking it in that Judeo-Christian judgment thing again, right? And there are no good people and bad people in the spirit realm. There's no such thing as this is a good person, this is a bad person. The person who polluted the oceans is on a certain part of his path or whatever he came here to do, and when he goes to the other side, he will learn and be healed and be given opportunity for growth. He will see clearly and feel clearly the damage and pain he may have inflicted, and he will be given an opportunity to work through that. So I think of it as a school system. So, you know, you have preschool all the way up to postgraduate university, and everybody's coming in and out at different times. So you can't really say that a little kid in 5th grade isn't as smart or as valuable as a graduate student, right? So we're all just working it from where we are. And there are no higher or lower levels. It's all, I mean, there's millions and millions of levels, but they're not higher and lower. They're all equal, depending on what you are here to learn. It's kind of like that thing about nonlinear time. The levels don't have hierarchy or judgment to them. They're just there. And you go to wherever you want to go in terms of your work. So I have often had bereaved parents, when I have this conversation with them, say to me, well, are you telling me that my dead child is in the same place as Hitler? Because, of course, Hitler is our poster boy for evil, right? That always comes up in every conversation. And my answer is yes, you know, because we're all one. We have equal positions on the kaleidoscope. Hitler is on the kaleidoscope just exactly like you are. And like your precious, you know, baby who died is. What they're doing and what they're working on these different levels is obviously not the same. They came to Earth to do different work and do different things. But those levels and those curricula, there is no judgment. They're not higher and lower. Obviously, the being that was Hitler is in a particular academic program that is very different than the being that is Mother Teresa. Or maybe not. Maybe they're in the same program. Think about that. Just working it from different angles. Real different when you take the judgment off.
Yeah, so important.
Yeah. So hard to do. And that's why people have so much trouble with forgiveness, because they think that forgiveness means that they have to condone or accept the bad thing that happened, where what it really means is you have to get yourself to a state of consciousness where you understand how the kaleidoscope works.
Yeah.
Not easy. And not everybody gets there. You know, everybody's doing the work they came here to do.
Mm-hmm.
We do, you know, I can't play a piano concerto, but I can understand the kaleidoscope. We're all doing something different.
I love that image of the kaleidoscope because it's colorful.
Yeah.
You know, the kaleidoscopes make beautiful images, you know, all together, all different, the pieces, all different shapes and colors forming in different patterns. And
Yeah, and colors are vibrational frequencies, aren't they?
mm-hmm.
That's what colors are. So in that kaleidoscope are all the frequencies. Pretty cool. I couldn't have made that up myself. You know, that came straight from heaven to my brain.
Oh, that's so wonderful. And so people can find out more about you by going to your website, swaninheaven.com.
Well, I have a bunch of websites. The best one is Daniel, my last name, Daniel, direct.net. And from there, you can go to the various different books and websites.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being with us and for sharing your beautiful stories and insights and the work you're doing.
Thank you. I have had so much fun doing this.
Oh, good. Me too.
I'm so grateful for this opportunity, Robin. It's wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you. Well, I look forward to doing this again, and I wish you wonderful success with your conference, and may the work you're doing and the information just ripple out and keep growing and building and shifting our perception of death and the afterlife and life.
Yeah, that's what it's all about.